It should have been the happiest day of my life, but at that moment I already knew the truth. Fred and my sister Anne. They had betrayed me, and today their lies were going to come to the surface. I stood in front of the mirror in my white dress, but I felt like I was trapped. No matter how many times I repeated that it was a dream, reality slapped me in the face. Anne was pregnant by my fiancé.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
How did it all start? It's hard to say. There are times when you sense something wrong, but you push those thoughts away for fear of shattering your own illusion of happiness. I saw the way they looked at each other, saw their strange touches. But I didn't want to believe. I couldn't believe. Until that day. Standing in front of me was Fred, my fiancé, dressed perfectly in an austere suit. His gaze was intense, like he was expecting something scary, but trying to hide it behind a duty smile. Anne stood in the corner in her bridesmaid dress, avoiding my gaze. And I knew it wasn't just pre-wedding nerves. It was more than that. Guests were already gathering in the hall, all anxiously awaiting the start of the ceremony. My mom was checking the final preparations, my dad was chatting with relatives. The atmosphere was perfect at first glance. I walked past Anne, trying not to meet her gaze. At that moment I had only one question running through my mind. Why? How could they? Why her? I tried to convince myself that I had to keep my cool, if only for the sake of those who had come to the wedding, for the sake of those who believed in our love. But inside me everything was crumbling. It had been so long since I'd first met Fred. We met at one of the parties at the university, and he immediately caught my eye. Tall, confident, with an enigmatic smile. He was the man every girl dreams of. But what attracted me the most was his sincerity. Or so it seemed to me. We started dating, and every day our relationship grew stronger and stronger. He was my first real man. Someone I could imagine a lifetime with. We made plans for the future, discussed where we would live, how many children we would have. Everything seemed perfect. Fred even introduced me to his family, and I felt like I was part of something bigger. Anne was happy for me. She was always on my side, supporting me in difficult moments, and I believed she and I had the strongest sister relationship. Anne was younger than me but often seemed more confident. She made friends easily and was always surrounded by people. I, on the other hand, was more reserved, preferring a small circle of loved ones. When Fred proposed to me and was the first to hug me and tell me how happy she was for me, I never imagined that she would be the cause of the biggest betrayal of my life. On the eve of the wedding I began to notice strange things. At first it was small things. Fred sometimes refused to talk about honeymoon plans, and began to talk to me less, as if she were avoiding conversation. But I didn't pay much attention to it. I chalked it up to pre-wedding stress. It's just nerves, I told myself every time something seemed wrong. But the closer the wedding got, the more I noticed. One day I saw Fred and Anne talking privately behind the house when I thought no one could see. They were standing too close. Their looks spoke more than words. That was when I first felt a chill in my chest. What are they doing together? A thought flashed through my mind. But I pushed it away immediately. It's just a coincidence. My sister and my fiancé, they're friends, aren't they? They've always gotten along well. But at that moment something changed inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even when Fred came back to me with a knowing smile as if nothing had happened. I decided not to bring it up, not to spoil the atmosphere before the wedding. But doubts were already lodged in my heart. And so the wedding day came. The guests filled the hall, everything was ready. I had to walk down the aisle to my happiness, but internally I was already broken. I knew the truth I had to learn the day before the wedding. The sun shone brightly through the windows as I stood in front of the mirror, admiring my reflection in my wedding dress. The morning had started so perfectly. My girlfriends were laughing and discussing the final preparations while I felt like a true princess. This day was mine, and I was looking forward to the moment when Fred, my favorite, would become my husband. However, deep inside me, a worry and foreboding feeling was ripening. It was as if something was whispering to me that things were not as perfect as they seemed. I tried to banish these thoughts, assuring myself that it was just nervousness before the wedding. I couldn't imagine what was really ahead of me. Just before the ceremony, I decided to rest a bit and went out on the balcony to breathe in some fresh air. Down in the backyard, voices could be heard. It was Fred and my sister Anne. I knew they were talking, but I didn't think I could hear anything important. Suddenly their voices became clearer. "Fred, you don't realize how difficult this is for me," Anne said, and I caught a note of desperation in her voice. "I understand, but we can't keep it a secret. You have to think about Stacy," Fred replied, and his words stuck with me. Something about their conversation didn't feel right. Why were they discussing me? I pressed myself against the railing, listening. They didn't realize I was looking at them, and every word they said cut me like a sharp knife. "She can't find out. I can't lose you, Fred. You know I'm pregnant," she said, and in that moment the whole world around me stopped. I felt a cold sweat cover my body. Pregnant? By him? Anne's words hit me like a shot in the arm. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. My sister and my fiancé, the two people closest to me, had betrayed me in the most heinous way. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. At that moment, all the joy that was still in me burned away. I couldn't imagine what was happening. Their secret, which I had accidentally learned about, was going to be announced at my wedding. How could they do such a thing? A hurricane of emotions raged inside me. I felt all strength leave me. I was not only betrayed, but humiliated. Why did I ever marry Fred? He didn't deserve me. I couldn't let that happen. I took a step back, and that's when my friend Laura came up to me. Seeing the look of horror on my face, she asked, "Stacy, what's wrong? You look pale." I couldn't get a word out. Anne's words were still running around in my head like a vicious circle. I knew I needed to talk to Fred, but how could I do that? At some point he was going to have to come get me so we could walk down the aisle, and I didn't know if I would even be able to see him. At this point, the sounds of the wedding were coming from the hall, and I realized that if I didn't come out for the ceremony, it was going to start without me. I couldn't let them all see what I looked like. All the smiles, the joy, it would be hypocritical. I was trapped in my own feelings and didn't know what to do. Laura asked again, "Are you okay?" And I pulled myself together and said, "No. I need to talk to Fred. Immediately." I headed for the exit, and every cell in me fought back, but I had no choice. I felt tears come to my eyes. I was going to expose this sin and not let them ruin my day. As I walked back into the auditorium, the laughter and music were playing in unison, but inside me everything was breaking down. I walked past the guests who were interjecting and whispering, but I paid them no attention. I saw Fred and Anne standing together and laughing. The smiles on their faces looked so fake, and I felt everything inside me stirring. The ceremony had begun. I stood at the very aisle, clutching the bouquet so tightly that the white roses in my hands began to remind me of the fragility with which any illusion can be shattered. The guests stood up, the music grew louder, and I slowly made my way toward Fred, who was waiting for me at the altar. But I already knew it wasn't love. It was a lie, and tonight it would end. Fred tried to hide his excitement, but I could see his eyes running nervously around the room as he cast quick glances at Anne, who sat among the guests. He thought tonight would go smoothly, that I wouldn't find out the truth, but his plans had fallen apart. I stopped right in front of him, his hand reaching for mine, but I didn't respond. I froze, gazing into his eyes as if searching for the last vestige of honesty in this man. But there was only fear and betrayal there. "I can't," I said aloud, and silence instantly fell over the room. The guests stopped whispering, the musicians fell silent, and all eyes were on me. Fred smiled weakly, as if he didn't know what was happening. "What do you mean, Stacy?" he asked, but his voice was already shaking. "I can't marry you," I repeated more firmly. "Because you slept with my sister." The hall erupted. Every word echoed around the room like a clap of thunder. I saw the shock on the faces of our friends and family. I saw my mother cover her mouth with her hands, unable to believe what was happening. Fred turned pale, his face gray with horror. And froze in place, panic in her eyes. "You... what are you talking about?" he mumbled, unable to find the words. I laughed, bitter and harsh. "How dare you pretend you don't understand? How long were you going to hide it? Did you think I wouldn't find out you got her pregnant?" It wasn't just anger in my voice, it was a cry of the soul, full of pain and disappointment. The whole room froze as if someone had pressed pause. The faces of the guests stretched in shock, and I stood in the middle of the chaos, unable to move. Fred and Anne stood before me like two marionettes whose ropes were about to break. My heart was beating so hard I thought it was going to jump out of my chest. I clenched my fists, feeling my nails dig into my palms, but the pain was nothing compared to what was going on inside of me. "Fred," I shouted, and all eyes turned to me. He turned and met my gaze, but instead of love and joy I saw only shock. At that moment I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. "I know about you," I said, and the words spilled out of me. There was silence in the hall, everyone froze, looking at us. I felt anger and determination take over. No one could hide the truth now. Anne turned pale and Fred opened his mouth, trying to find the words. But I wasn't going to wait. You both betrayed me. You, my sister, and you, my fiancé. How could you do this to me at my wedding? I screamed. As if in response to my words, there were whispers and indignant voices in the hall. I saw the guests staring at us and some even darted their eyes out in shock. I was at the center of the scandal, and this moment was going to be the final blow to all of us. Fred tried to explain himself, but I didn't want to hear any of his excuses. I had already realized that he wasn't the man I loved. Get out. Get out of my life. I shouted and turned around and walked out of the hall, leaving behind a heartbreak and betrayal that would never leave me. Fred stepped forward, his face contorted with pain or fear. I couldn't figure out what was moving him at that moment. He raised his hand as if he wanted to touch me, but I recoiled, not wanting to see his face, not wanting to hear a word come out of his mouth. It's not what it looks like, Stacy. His voice sounded muffled, as if everything that was happening was just a nightmare that was about to end. But it wasn't a dream, it was reality, the cruelest reality I could imagine. I looked at my sister, the one who had been with me throughout my life, and had always been there for me like my shadow, and I trusted her more than anyone. And now she stood before me, betraying me in the lowest possible way. She could not meet my gaze. Her eyes read guilt, but I didn't care anymore. Are you pregnant? My voice trailed off into a scream. Anne, for the first time in a while, looked me in the eye but didn't answer. Her silence was the loudest confession I'd ever heard. All my worst fears were confirmed. Her belly, which I had previously thought was just overweight, now took on a completely different meaning. The noise in the auditorium was increasing. People were whispering, going over the details of what had happened, as if a scene from a cheap soap opera was playing out right in front of their eyes. I suddenly realized that they could see us. They saw me. And that humiliation was the worst of it. I, like a doll being abused in front of everyone, stood there in a white dress meant for another, happier day. Fred was saying something, his words turning into meaningless noise amidst my internal screaming. I didn't know it would happen like this, Stacy. It was a mistake. You have to understand. But I wasn't listening anymore. All his excuses, all his words were lies, just like our whole life we were going to build together. At some point I felt my legs start to shake. It felt like the whole world was crumbling beneath me, and I just had nowhere to go. But instead of falling, I gathered all my strength to stand up straight. I wasn't going to let them break me. I looked at Fred and Anne, these two people I had once considered the closest people to me, and I realized they weren't worthy of my love or my regret. How could you? My words were addressed not only to Fred but to Anne as well. Her face turned pale and she struggled to hold back her tears. But I wasn't going to pity her. She had chosen her own path, and I wasn't going to turn a blind eye to her betrayal. How could you do this to me? I repeated, feeling my eyes fill with tears, but I held back, not letting them escape. Anne took a step forward, but I stopped her with a sharp motion of my hand. Stay away from me. I shouted, and her footsteps froze. I couldn't believe that the one I had always protected, the one who had been there for me in the most difficult moments of my life, was now standing in front of me, ruining everything we had. Stacy, I'm sorry, her voice finally came out quietly, almost like a whisper. But forgiveness was the last thing I could offer. You ruined everything, I uttered, looking her straight in the eyes. You took everything from me, my family, my love, my faith in you. How were you going to live with that? There was no answer. Only silence filled the space between us. The crowd began to whisper louder. Some of the guests seemed to be trying to say something, but no one dared to intervene. My head was spinning as if someone had hit the rewind button, and I couldn't stop this maelstrom of emotions. At that moment I felt like an outsider in my own life. Fred tried to approach me again, his face contorted with panic. Stacy, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to come to this. It was a mistake. He reached out to me, as if his words could change what had already happened. But I knew the truth. None of this was an accident, but a conscious choice, a choice that had ruined our relationship. A mistake? I laughed, but the laugh was bitter and full of despair. You call that a mistake? The mistake was believing you. The mistake was loving you. The words burst out of me with such force that I felt my voice shake. Stacy, please, let's talk, he started to plead, but I recoiled as if his touch could burn me. What can we talk about? I looked straight into his eyes, which no longer held the love I'd once seen. You've been deceiving me. Both of you. And you knew all along that she was carrying your child, and yet you still stand here in front of me like nothing happened. Fred froze in place, his face contorted with pain or fear of what would happen next. I could see his lips twitching, like he was ready to say something else, but the words stuck in his throat, and stood motionless as if clenched between the two of us, unable to utter a sound. What, did you think I'd never find out? My voice cut through the chaos with icy coldness. Thought you could play with my life so easily? With my family? I could feel the anger filling me to the brim, tearing outward, sweeping away all the boundaries I'd once set for myself. Fred took a step back, as if my words were blows he was trying to dodge. But there was no turning back. I couldn't let him control the situation anymore. You ruined everything, Fred. Our life. Our love was fake from the beginning, wasn't it? Anne, who had been silent all this time, finally tried to say something, but I didn't give her a chance. Don't you dare. I shouted sharply, raising my hand as if I wanted to stop her before she dared utter a single word. You destroyed everything we had. You didn't just betray me, you destroyed our entire family. The voices in the hall grew louder and louder. Some of the guests began to leave, not wanting to witness this shocking spectacle, but most remained as if mesmerized by this horrible drama. I saw faces that had recently been full of joy and happiness now contorted with shock and bewilderment. You're even pregnant. I wasn't screaming anymore, but my voice was full of despair and pain. You're carrying his child, and all this time I was in the dark. How could you, Anne? How could you do this to your own sister? Anne lowered her eyes. I could see her shoulders shaking, but she didn't dare look at me. She'd always been someone I'd protected, someone I'd loved, despite all her mistakes. But now standing in front of me was not the Anne I knew, but a complete stranger. And this person was ready to destroy everything we'd built together. You didn't just take a man away from me, and, I continued, feeling tears come to my eyes. You took away my future. You took away my opportunity to be happy. I looked around, watching as the guests moved around looking for an exit, but I couldn't leave. My life stood on the edge of a precipice, and I couldn't just turn around and walk away like they did. Fred stood silent, not knowing what to say. He realized that all was lost, and nothing he could say would bring me back. But I was still waiting for an answer. I wanted to hear something that would explain why it had happened. But the truth was too brutal to accept. My mother stepped forward, her face pale, looking back and forth at me and Anne, unable to believe what was happening. Is it true? She whispered, turning to Anne, as if she was still hoping for some answer that would make things right. Anne could no longer look into her mother's eyes. She cried, and that weak, almost pathetic cry only made me more furious. Yes, it's true, I said, calm now, though I was tearing up inside. She's pregnant. And it's not just a rumor. I heard everything. The guests began to whisper, but no one dared say a word. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. My father, who had been standing in the far corner, suddenly came forward. His face blazed with anger. Anne, he shouted, his voice breaking the silence. Is it true? Did you sleep with Fred? Anne froze, her face wet with tears. She nodded, unable to find the words to justify it. Her father glared at Fred, full of contempt and hatred. You're nothing, he hissed. How could you do this? How could you betray our family? Fred tried to say something again, but his words were drowned out by the noise of the uproar. The guests began to get up from their seats, not knowing where to put themselves, some trying to leave the room, others trying to figure out what was going to happen next. It was a real show, but this time the main character was my ruined life. Everything was heading for chaos. Anne tried to run out of the hall, but her mother stopped her, demanding an explanation. My father was already waving his arms, furiously discussing with Fred his betrayal. And I stood in the middle of this theater of the absurd and watched my dreams, my hopes, crumble before my eyes. You've both lost me, I said quietly but firmly. My sister and my fiancé. You betrayed me, and now you have to live with it. The scandal at the wedding had reached its peak. The noise of the guests already resembled the loud humming of a beehive. I saw Fred's mother covering her face with her hands, as if she couldn't believe that her son was involved in such a horror. My mother, on the other hand, stood back, her face dead pale. She seemed lost, her eyes darting between Anne and me, unable to believe what was happening. At one point, one of the guests tried to intervene, raising their hand as if they were going to make a speech or try to calm us down. But before they could say anything, I turned sharply in their direction, causing them to freeze. "Don't you dare!" I snarled through my teeth like a wild animal ready to defend its territory. Fred stepped closer, his steps cautious, as if he was afraid that one wrong move could cause an even bigger explosion. "Stacy, please, let's discuss this in private," he said, but I couldn't stand his presence any longer. "In private?" I laughed, this time loudly, sarcastically. "You want to discuss this in private? After humiliating me in front of all those people?" "No, Fred. We're going to discuss it right here, in front of everyone. Let everyone see what a scoundrel you've turned out to be." His face went pale again, and I saw his confidence begin to crumble. He realized I was no longer a woman he could soothe with sweet speeches. I was ready to go all the way, to reveal the whole truth and destroy what was left of his dignity. "Did you think I would just cry and beg you to come back to me?" My words cut the air like a knife. "No, Fred. I'm not the weak girl you always thought I was. I won't be your plaything anymore." Anne stood back, her face dead pale. She didn't dare even look at me. Her hands were shaking and her stomach seemed to be making her nauseous. I might have felt sorry for her if the situation had been different. But now all feelings for her had evaporated, leaving only emptiness. "You knew all along that you were ruining my life," I said quietly but coldly, turning to Anne. "And what did you think? That I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't care?" The words I spoke seemed heavy and filled not only with anger but also with deep disappointment. The atmosphere of chaos continued around us, but in that moment everything shrank around us, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist and it was just me, Fred, and Anne. I couldn't believe that this day, which was supposed to be one of the happiest of my life, had turned out to be such a horror. The guests stuck to their seats, stared at us as if we were some sort of ominous spectacle. I saw one of them whispering to a neighbor, pointing at Fred and me. Their looks were full of pity, curiosity, and perhaps even enjoyment of the scandal. I couldn't judge them. I myself was mesmerized by what was happening, unable to take my eyes off my husband and the sister with whom I shared my life and love. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you confess?" I demanded, looking Fred in the eye. He seemed to realize his games were over. The words wouldn't come out, and the silence was burning. I'd hoped to see some remorse on his face, but there was only confusion. That disappointment burned even worse. I didn't know how to say it," he finally squeezed out, and I felt my insides curdle with anger. He didn't know how to say it. Is that an excuse? His apology crumbled to dust before my eyes. "Didn't know how to say it? You think that's an excuse? You betrayed me and now you're trying to find a way to justify your betrayal?" I blurted out, unable to contain my anger. "You were there for her when you should have been with me." My words echoed through the hall, and I noticed a few people start to whisper. It may have seemed silly, but I hoped they were finally seeing the real Fred, the man who had cheated and betrayed. The people I'd once considered friends were now looking at us like characters in a soap opera, and there was something awful yet liberating about that. Fred tried to move closer again, but I pushed him away. "Don't come near me. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear about how you didn't know how to say." Anne seemed to come to her senses and finally decided to intervene. "Stacy, listen," she uttered, but I interrupted her. I couldn't listen to her explanation, as if she could justify her actions with words. "What are you going to say? That it was an accident? That you couldn't resist temptation? You were pregnant, Anne. You weren't thinking about anyone but yourself." My breathing was intermittent, but I continued, not giving her a chance. I wanted everyone to hear her words, her excuses. Fred turned to Anne this time as if trying to support her, but I could see his own soul already shattered. He didn't know what to do, and that added to my strength. I felt like a breath of fresh air in this scandal. "You have no idea what it feels like, Stacy," she said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't know he would be like this. You don't need any excuses," I interrupted. Every look she gave Fred made me want to tear her apart. This bond they'd built on my shattered dreams was so strong that I didn't know how to deal with it. I looked at Fred and something clicked in my chest. I realized that this day wasn't going to be a day where I would humble myself and forgive. This day would be the beginning of something new for me. My mother, who had been standing off to the side, finally couldn't take it anymore and stepped forward. Her face contorted with anger, and I could feel that she too was on fire, just as I was. She looked at me, then at Anne and Fred, and her voice was full of conviction. "You're both unworthy of this. You ruined your sister's life." My mother's words swept through the room, and I saw some of the guests begin to whisper vigorously. It was a real drama, and even I, who was caught in the middle of it, couldn't help but notice some of the attendees recording something on their phones, capturing the moment. "This is not only your wedding, it's a disgrace," she shouted, and her voice boomed like lightning in that depressed hall. I felt supported, as if her words set me free. I am not alone, my family is standing behind me, even in this hell. I turned to my parents, and seeing their support, I turned my gaze back to Fred and Anne. "You can try to justify yourself, but in my eyes you will forever be a traitor, Fred. You and you," I pointed at Anne. "You have both become traitors in the eyes of everyone here." Like a bolt of lightning, the silence in the room was pierced by a rumble of whispers as I spoke words that were clothed in anger and bewilderment. The guests, previously silent, began to stir, discussing what had happened. Every pair of eyes was fixed on us, and it gave me confidence. In that moment, I realized that all these people who had come to celebrate our love were now witnessing its destruction. Fred, having lost all hope, began to apologize, but every word he said only made things worse. "Stacy, I was weak, I didn't know what to do. She was there for me, I couldn't." "You couldn't?" I interrupted him again. "You couldn't help yourself when she was around, but you thought you could tell me the truth? Thought you could hide it forever," I said bitterly, feeling the anger mixed with betrayal boiling up inside me. Anne continued to stand silent, her eyes full of tears meeting my gaze, but I didn't feel sorry for her. This victim, it seemed to me, had no sympathy whatsoever. I knew her actions were deliberate, and that made me even angrier. "Are you telling me that everything between us was just a game to you?" I hissed. "Have you ever considered that there are consequences behind your actions, Anne? You've betrayed not only me but yourself." The guests in the room were already whispering about what was going on. It felt like they were watching something exciting, as if it were a movie where the main characters themselves didn't understand what was going on. I realized that the scandal had reached a critical point. Suddenly someone from the audience shouted, "Shame on you!" And the crowd supported this chant. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and in that moment I realized that this whole situation was not only a destruction, but also an opportunity to get back on my feet. "I'm not going to grovel before you," I stated, lifting my chin. "You think you can just betray me like that and walk away as if nothing happened?" Fred looked at me with horror, realizing that his integral role in this play was now turning against him. I wasn't about to back down. I decided that in this moment I was going to be the one to destroy his world. In that moment I realized that there was nothing worse than betrayal, and I had to deal with it. Anne suddenly sobbed, but it didn't move me. "Stacy, I didn't mean for this to happen." Her voice was full of desperation, but there wasn't an ounce of sincerity. At that moment I realized that she was just trying to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" I repeated, raising my voice. "You didn't mean for this to happen when you spent the night with my fiancé? You didn't think about how it would feel for me when I come to you for advice and you're with him at the same time." The crowd was whispering again, their gazes sliding between us. I could feel the tension building, like a taut string ready to burst. At some point, as I looked at the faces of those present, I realized that this situation had become more than just a personal scandal. It had become something of a public trial where I was the chief witness. Fred looked nervous and scared. He was still trying to explain himself. "Stacy, I was blind, I didn't mean to hurt you. You know how much I love you." At his words I just grinned. "Love you? How can you love and betray at the same time? You think you have the right to decide for me how I should react to your cheating?" My words sounded like a gunshot. Every time I said them I felt anger burst out of my chest. Anne lifted her head, her eyes full of tears. "I couldn't tell you, it was too hard. I thought you wouldn't find out," she tried to justify herself. But her excuses were as worthless as her actions. "You thought you could just keep hiding it? And the more you hide it, the worse it gets. I trusted you. You're my sister and now you're a traitor." I shouted out, and that feeling of betrayal that was inside only increased. The atmosphere in the hall heated up to the limit. The guests began to actively discuss what was happening, as if it was the most exciting performance they had ever seen. I could feel someone taking notes on their phone, and it annoyed me even more. "You could have at least tried to explain everything, but instead you chose to be selfish," I continued. "You plunged me into this chaos, and now your sin is seen by everyone. It's your shame, not mine." Fred and Anne stood before me like two battered puppies, and it was hard for me to know what it was about this moment that gave me more pleasure. the realization of their suffering or the humiliation they felt at my candor. "I can't believe you could even do that to your sister," Fred said, confusion in his voice. But no matter how hard he tried, I knew his words meant nothing. They couldn't erase the fact that he had cheated on me. I slowly turned around and looked at my parents, who were standing at the edge of the hall. They looked at me with concern and pride at the same time. At that moment, I realized that I had to end this once and for all. "Everything that was between us, Fred, is now in the past. I'm not going to waste my life on traitors. I choose my life, and it doesn't include you or your mistress," I declared, letting my words soak into the atmosphere like poisonous smoke. The crowd murmured again, as if waiting for my next move. I saw someone capture the moment when I turned to my sister and uttered, "You ruined my life, and now I won't be able to forgive you. I can't imagine how I can continue to be a family with you." The atmosphere in the room was tense. I knew I was speaking not only for myself, but for everyone who had ever been betrayed. In that moment, I felt stronger than ever. I was ready for a new life with no traitors around. Fred tried to approach me again, but I pulled away. "Don't come near me, I don't want to see you. You've just become a part of my history, a part one want to forget," I said, feeling the determination building up inside me. My words hung in the air like the thud of a bell. I was aware of the drama unfolding in front of everyone's eyes, and in that moment I felt both strong and vulnerable. As I hit those words, I questioned not only myself, but everyone who witnessed this shame. The words, "I can't see you," echoed, and I felt eyes on me. Each look seemed like a focus, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. I stood up, looking around the room, and for a moment I felt like I was no longer just an observer, but a participant in my own show. Fred, clenching his fists, stood still, his face twisted in shame. I was amazed at how depressed he looked. Every movement he made said he'd lost control of the situation, and that gave me strength. "This evening was mine. You chose this life, Fred. You chose to cheat and betray," I uttered, finally seeing his helplessness. "I will never be a part of your deception." Someone in the crowd whispered, "That probably won't be the only thing she says." I could feel the excitement and energy permeating the air, and it gave me strength. I wanted everyone to know that cheating wasn't just a mistake, it was a sin that should be condemned. And tried to intervene again. "I just didn't know how to do it. You were so happy and I couldn't." Her words again had no meaning, and I knew they were only meant for her self-justification. "What right do you have to determine who will be happy and who won't?" I shouted, leaving her no chance. "You acted selfishly, and now you're going to be held accountable for it." She sobbed again, and I could feel the buzz building up around me. The crowd was eager to continue, and at that moment I realized I couldn't stop. I had to finally sever all ties that bound me to this pair of traitors. "You thought you could just walk away from this? You ruined my life, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you ruin my future," I uttered, feeling the words spit out of me. "I choose my path, and it doesn't include either of you." The guests at the wedding, looking at me, seemed impressed and intrigued. This wasn't just a public exposure, it became something more. I was going to take my life into my own hands and leave this dirt behind. The words, "I choose my path," I uttered with a clear purpose. I knew that in this moment I was doing more than just giving up on my love. I was breaking down the walls that confined me, freeing myself from the yoke of betrayal. "Fred, you no longer have power over me," I said, and in that moment everything changed. I felt the pressure release and a new feeling ripened in my heart, freedom. I threw the bouquet on the floor and walked towards the exit, leaving behind all those who were supposed to be part of the happiest day of my life. But that day had become my worst nightmare. Outside, I breathed in the cold air and felt myself growing stronger with each step. This story is not mine to tell now. Let them sort out their own mistakes. I walked slowly toward the exit, but I was seething inside. Outside the wedding hall, as if in a stunned void, I heard muffled voices through the open windows. The guests began to talk more actively among themselves, some whispering, some shocked, some clutching their heads. It was a real spectacle. In an instant, a lavish ceremony turned into a farce. My shoes tapped softly on the floor, echoing in the empty hallway. I paused for a second, taking a deep breath, and then turned to look at the hall again through the open doors. The storm was still boiling there. My father was shouting something loudly, waving his arms, and my mother was trying to stop him, but she looked shattered too. Anne was still standing in the center, pale as if she had been drained of every last drop. Fred slowly stepped back, his face pale, as if he had finally realized what he had done. In that moment, I realized that my life would never be the same again. The second I learned the truth, everything had crumbled, and now I was standing on the rubble of the past. There's no point in staying here anymore, I thought. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the feeling that I had to put a final stop to this nightmare, or maybe I wanted everyone to know the truth before the end. I went back into the hall. The guests fell silent at the sight of me, as if they were afraid I would say something even more horrible. I walked over to Fred, who was still standing there, unable to move. "What, now you're going to run away too?" My words sounded cold and sobering. "That's what you've always done. Running away from trouble." He tried to say something, but I didn't give him a chance. I turned to the guests and, raising my hand as if I were reading a sentence, I announced loudly, "For those who haven't figured it out yet, my fiancé cheated on me with my sister and she's pregnant by him. That's the whole answer to why this wedding is a lie." The hall froze, as if frozen at that moment. No one could say a word. And then the whispers started again, louder, more aggressive. People looked at each other as if they were about to hold a trial. Their eyes were literally devouring Fred and Anne. Even my relatives, who had seemed to have come here to support us, now looked at him with undisguised contempt. What a humiliation. I heard someone's voice. "I've never seen anything like it," someone whispered next to me. At that moment, my father exploded. His patience was at an end, and now he lashed out furiously at Fred. "You bastard!" His voice boomed, and his father grabbed Fred by the collar, pushing him backward, straight into the wall. "How dare you do this to my daughter? To our family?" Fred desperately tried to free himself, but my father's strength was in anger, and that anger seemed unstoppable. "Dad, stop!" I shouted, though I didn't have an ounce of regret for Fred inside me. I just didn't want this drama to end in more disaster. But my mother, no longer holding back, walked over to Anne. She was like a shadow of the person I knew. There was sadness and betrayal in her eyes. She gazed at her youngest daughter, trying to realize how this could have happened. "And how could you?" Her voice sounded almost lifeless, and there was more pain than anger in it. Anne tried to justify herself, but tears choked her words. "I didn't mean to, it was." Her voice shook, but every word she said only made her mother's eyes grow fiercer. "You ruined everything," her mother whispered softly. "You betrayed your sister. You betrayed us." The silence in the hall was becoming unbearable. The guests stood motionless, as if no one knew how to react to such a family tragedy. I stood in the middle of this chaos and suddenly realized that I no longer wanted to be a part of this spectacle. I didn't care what people said. I didn't care what happened to Fred and Anne. All I wanted was to leave this nightmare. "I'm leaving," I said out loud, and in that moment I felt an overwhelming weight lifted from my shoulders. Fred, finally free from my father's arms, tried to come toward me again, but I stopped him with a glare. "Don't you dare say a word to me. We're done. You're nothing to me anymore." I didn't turn around anymore. There was no point anymore. Let them stay with their lies and betrayal. Let them live in this filthy world they've made for themselves. I'm getting out of it, and it's not my story anymore. I headed for the exit again, but this time I felt different. With each step I became freer, and when I finally found myself outside, the cold air embraced me like a release. There was the unknown ahead, but at least it was my unknown. And I finally felt alive. When I stepped outside, I felt like I had breathed in a full breath for the first time in hours. The sun was slipping towards sunset, and the cold wind was wrapping around me like a symbol of a new, unknown freedom. I stood in front of a large, opulent building that had seemed like a dream only a few hours ago, a place where I would become a wife, where everything would begin anew with a clean slate. Now it was a symbol of everything I'd lost. But what had I really lost? The man who betrayed me with my sister? A family that now held the spirit of betrayal? I realized that the loss wasn't really as great as I had thought it was just a few hours ago. Yes, it hurt, it tore me apart, but deep down I knew, better now than through years of living a lie. I walked slowly down the path, away from that damned building, and with each step, the feelings of pain, anger, and humiliation receded. It felt like with every breath I took, I regained my own power, my independence. I remembered all those moments when I'd blindly trusted Fred, how I'd built a future full of naive hope. And him? All this time he'd lied to my face, hiding his sordid affair with my sister. And, at that moment, her image appeared in front of me. My little sister, my own blood, who had always seemed so close to me. How could she? But there was no answer to that question. I realized that I would never find logic in what she did. There was no love in it, no rational explanation. It was betrayal, simple and stupid. I don't know how much time passed as I walked along the road, thinking about what had happened, but suddenly I noticed a car pull up next to me. The door was ajar and a voice came from inside. "Stacy." I recognized that voice. It was Lana, my friend from university. She looked worried, but there was more sympathy in her eyes than questions. "I heard what happened," she paused, trying to find the right words. "Are you okay?" I grinned. "Okay?" That was too hard a question. But I nodded, realizing there was no point in talking about it now. Everything had already happened and I needed to move on. "Come on, I'll drive you home," she offered, opening the door wider. I silently got into the car and we drove towards my house. Lana didn't ask any unnecessary questions, which I was grateful for. We drove in silence, and it was the perfect time to process everything. The anger and pain that had just been simmering inside me began to subside, giving way to devastation. At home, as I walked into my apartment, I realized that all this time I hadn't had a plan in case the wedding fell apart. I was literally alone, without all the people who were supposed to be there for me on the day. But I felt something else, relief. The wedding could have turned my life into a perpetual game of lying and submitting to other people's plans. And now, despite all the pain, I had the freedom to make my life the way I wanted it. I turned on the light in the living room, tossed my shoes by the front door, and sat on the couch, deep in thought. Everything seemed surreal. I had just lived through my worst nightmare, the betrayal, the scandal, the loss of loved ones. And yet I had a feeling inside me that this was the beginning of something new. My phone suddenly vibrated and Fred's name popped up on the screen. He was trying to call again. I glanced at the screen and without thinking I dropped the call. His words didn't matter to me now. He had lost the right to be a part of my life. On top of that came another message, this time from Anne. "Stacy, I'm sorry." I stared at those words for a long time, trying to figure out what she meant. Sorry? As if a few words could erase all the wounds they'd left behind. But I didn't want to sink any further into that cycle. I put the phone down on the table and stood up. The future seemed uncertain to me now, but there was strength in that. I had no plans, but I had the freedom to choose where to go and what to do. And that was more than I could have imagined before. The scandal at the wedding had ruined not only my life, but theirs, Fred and Anne's. I didn't know how they would deal with the aftermath, but that was no longer my concern.